So thanks for all the positive responses for the paper reviews. Another open access paper from 2017 by John Kiley. Periodization hasn't been studied particularly extensively. There's more work from the strength training realm, but a lot less in such areas as team sports, which if you work in team sports, you'll probably understand how difficult it can be to periodize once you start to add in travel and fixtures. However, the periodization paradigm has been around for about 70 years, but probably actually began before that as ways of planning training. Originally, periodization came from weightlifting in the Soviet Union and was a strict, rigid design that purported to have performance benefits. One of the reasons strength training was probably a good starting point for periodization is that it's quite easily quantifiable: sets, reps, weight lifted, and so on. One of the cornerstones of this paper is that some research findings have been translated into periodization works, but periodization is a lot more complicated than this simplistic view, with multiple moving parts that have failed to be accounted for. The author reverts back to what could be viewed as the foundation of periodization, being the work of an endocrinologist called Hans Selye and his work on stress in the 1930s, and his general adaptation syndrome theory, or GAS for short. Essentially, one of Selye's main arguments was that stress was a medical and physiological condition, and any psychological stress was actually something separate. Furthermore, the work by Selye suggested that biological challenges occurred in quite a predictable way, by progressing through the same sequential phases: first alarm, then resistance, and if the challenge was too much or too stressful, this would result in the same outcome, termed exhaustion. In fact, Selye's term of stress was actually taken from engineering and was his way to describe an animal's biological response to a stressor. This led to the redefining of stress as a non-specific response of the body to any demand made upon it, and a stressor as a noxious agent stimulating gas. But by the mid-1960s, stress had been considered a bidirectional phenomenon, with physical stress affecting your mental state and vice versa. In fact, the author notes that later work in the 60s and 70s demonstrated that stress response varied substantially as a function of the situation, the individual, and the individual's history. The author puts across a good argument that if we go further into the scientific literature of why a certain way of periodization is better than any other, the rationale is actually very weak. Another salient argument by the author is that periodization is a mechanical procedure. If you work at this intensity, X, this many times Y, for this duration, Z, you will get the response of X, Y, Z. Therefore, based on Selye's rigid work on stress, periodization assumes that we can predict training outcomes in a linear fashion. This then leads to the belief that how you respond or improve to a training program is solely based on the input, again in a linear fashion, that X plus Y plus Z must equal X, Y, Z. For example, take genetically engineered twins through the same training plan, but if they're in a different nutritional or psycho-emotional states, they may respond completely different. The author also suggests that our psycho-emotional state, e.g. what mood you're in, your interpretation of the relevance of the training session, will impact your individual response to the training you do. This is a key argument by the author, as periodization theory really fails to recognise and account for this. While it may sound like the author is dismissing any of the work by Selye, or indeed those who brought periodization into the forefront of athletic development, this isn't actually the case. In fact, the author acknowledges that while Selye's almost revolutionary paradigm does contain quite a lot of partial truths, there's also partial validity, such as a mechanistic approach, and it shouldn't hide the critical omissions, especially in the prominent periodization literature. Overall, I think the paper is an excellent critique of the foundations of periodization and an opportunity to think again about how they came about and how the application of these principles may be an oversimplification of a very, very complex process.